All right. Very warm welcome to all of you to this event that is hosted by Sian Po, Chair on Sovereign Debt, together with Open Society Foundations. Thank you, Mark, for your presence here. This event is essentially to look at the hidden part of all these discussions we are having about how to manage debt. We talk a lot about the monetary aspects. We talk a lot about churning models to see how sustainable or unsustainable the debt stock is. We talk a lot about redoing the international financial architecture, but we are not talking enough about what lies behind this debt, which is people, and how much the debt stress that many countries are suffering today is impacting on the social fabric of these countries. So we are going to take this conversation from this human faces angle today. And in order to do that, we have Clemens Graf von Lückner, Clemens, that has co-authored a paper together with his colleague, Juan Jacob, that will be the intellectual basis for this conversation. Once we hear from Clemens, we are going to have comments from the panel, from Mark, Open Societies Foundation, from Fides Temba Temba, Executive Director of the Civil Society for Poverty Reduction in Zambia, from Sheila Pasarbaisioglu, Director, IMF, and last but not least, we have Axel van Trotzenborg, World Bank, who's stuck in traffic, but will join us in a moment. So let's give a bit of food to this summit that France is hosting to talk about debt, to talk about debt architecture, together with many leaders, including Mia Motley, instigator of the Bridgetown Initiative. Let's give them a lot of food for thought in the form of human faces. So without further ado, Clemens, over to you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. As we're coming in Paris together for this conference this week, we're at a 2-decade high in terms of countries that are in default. Since 2020, there have been a number of defaults added to that list. Lebanon, Zambia, Sri Lanka, Ghana, the list goes on a bit. One of those defaults, for me personally, hit home differently than the others. When Lebanon defaulted in 2020, it read a bit different than the other cases that I would usually follow through my research, because Lebanon had been a place where I lived a few years before that, because the institution that hosts us today, Sciences Po, had sent me there as an exchange student. So when Lebanon defaulted, it was not just the credit default swaps that I was reading about, the creditor composition formation, but instead I was hearing from my friends who were telling me, like one friend that was a doctor who had started his residency in Lebanon, who was let go of his job because the hospital closed and instead moved abroad. Another friend that was a teacher suddenly wasn't paid anymore, or when he was able to retrieve his salary, it was worth so little, it wasn't enough to pay for the petrol to bring him to school to work. And these stories kind of, or misfortunes, really got to me. But quickly after, I realized there's something else underlying that, and that's the real human costs of sovereign default. Every doctor that moves abroad leaves behind hundreds of patients. Every teacher that stops his job and does something else leaves students without any education. Just today, Lebanon actually announced that this year there's not going to be any graduation because there's no one to design an exam or grade them. And so I then started looking into other cases that were going on at the same time, and I had a bit of a déjà vu reading stories from Zambia, but also Sri Lanka. And so that motivated this research that I would like to present some excerpts from today, because as my co-authors, Carmen Reinhardt from Harvard University, Juan Pablo Farah Yacoub, who's also at Harvard, and Rita Ramal, who's at the World Bank, as we started looking into this systematically, we wanted to know, are these cases exceptions, or are there always human costs to sovereign default? I'd like, from the research that has produced at least one paper and lots of discussions within institutions that we've presented at, I want to present two takeaways today that I think are especially relevant for this ongoing debate. First, sovereign defaults cause human costs. And not only that, those human costs are felt most by those that can handle them least because they're the most vulnerable in the society. Secondly, this damage accrues over time. So it's not a cost that comes the moment where a sovereign defaults, but it continues growing as the sovereign remains in default. And that's an extremely important takeaways for the debate that we're having today. I see Axel coming in for the moment. Maybe before I go into showing you some of the results, you might ask, how do we even measure the cost of default? How does that work? I mean, ideally, of course, we would have to know what would have happened to a country if there had not been a default. Difficult to do because my co-authors are amazing, but even they can't tell what would have happened in other sort of scenarios. So what we do instead is that we look at comparable cases. That's to say countries that were very similar to the country that did default in all structural ways, and then see how that country developed on after the default. The difference between the two we can somewhat interpret as a counterfactual, especially the effect of default. If you want to learn more about the methodology that I don't want to bore you with right now, I invite you to have a look at the paper or discuss it with me after. For now, I'll leave it at that technically and jump into the results, the things that I guess most of us are most interested in. Defaults cause very aggressive human costs. We're macroeconomists, so the first thing that we did, of course, is we looked at GDP. What happens with GDP on average when countries default? Just for context, we look at 100 defaults here since 1900 for GDP. And what you see is that before the default, the country and its counterfactual, they sort of follow the same trend. However, soon after, we see this huge slump in growth. We have negative growth for at least 3 years, and then afterwards, growth comes back. However, it's at a lower level than it was before, and so there's no catching up to where the country would have been without the default. Now, of course, GDP is not really a perfect measure. There's countries that have pretty high GDP, but nonetheless, people are actually rather poor. If you look at Equatorial Guinea, very solid GDP, around 9,000 GDP per capita at around $9,000, but most of that money goes to a few pockets, and so half of the country doesn't have electricity at home, and around 60% of the teens don't go to school in that country. So GDP is not bad, but there's maybe something else going on there, and so we wanted to actually see what is happening to the social dimensions that sort of are correlated with GDP. Now, multidimensional poverty that is usually looked at takes some would require some micro data that we don't have for the period that we're interested in here. So what we instead look at is something that is closely correlated with all of the factors that go into multidimensional poverty: education, health. And that is essentially mortality, because better education leads to people living longer lives, and that better health does the same thing is quite obvious too. Moreover, even in countries with fairly poor institutions, we always have decent data on when people are born and when they die. So we then looked at life expectancy and what happens around default. And this is the first one that really shocked us when we saw the results for the first time. Again, our counterfactual in the country that would later default, they follow the same trend for a while, then the default happens, and then we see this wedge that opens up there. The gap, at some point, 10 years past default, amounts to around 1.1 percentage points. That is 1.1% relative to the base year, which here is 4 years prior to default, to give sort of a base year that we can compare across countries. 1.1%, 1.5 percentage points, that doesn't sound so clear, right? Well, if we look at an average life expectancy, that is like nearly a year of lifetime that is lost on average in the expected life expectancy in these countries. Now, even more thunderstruck to me personally when I saw it the first time was this one. Here we look at infant mortality, that is the share of babies born that don't make it to see their first birthday. Again, we see a very nice trend until the moment where a country defaults, and then we see this gap widening up. When I saw this one for the first time, I thought there was something wrong in the data because I just couldn't quite believe it. And that doesn't happen often as a macroeconomist when you look at data. Now, knowing that people die younger or very young after a default is kind of bad enough. But I want to come to my takeaway too. It's making things worse. Without a resolution of crisis, these costs accrue over time. That means that rather than a fait accompli, that is to say, well, you defaulted and that's it, you'll have people die younger or at very young ages, 10 years post, that's how it is, we have to live with it, you shouldn't have borrowed so much or you shouldn't have defaulted or whatever you might want to take as a conclusion. There is actually a very interesting correlation in our data that I would like to highlight here now. The fact that if you stay in default for longer, for whatever reason that may be because your creditors can't coordinate, because you can't come up with a government that can solve the crisis, it essentially leads to or correlates with higher social costs over time. What we see here first is a graph that maybe you remember just before when we looked at GDP. This is the same story again in red. Then in black, what we look at instead is we say, okay, let's now only consider the countries that actually managed to resolve their debt crisis and exit default. And whilst before we saw, okay, growth after the default is below its trend before on average, the countries that don't resolve their crisis don't actually come back to growth at all. They hit rock bottom and they stay there until they resolve their crisis. Very important takeaway. Now, life expectancy is a very similar picture. And we here look at the result 10 years post, but basically group the result into buckets of duration, that is how long there is between the default and the resolution of the debt crisis. And we see that the effects increase over time. That is to say, the life expectancy decreases by more when the defaults last longer. And here we see an average effect of around 1.52 years at the margin, but there is actually extremer cases. When Zambia defaulted first and last time in the 1980s, it had a life expectancy of 53 years. When it resolved its default, the life expectancy had dropped to 45 years. Infant mortality is maybe once again the most disheartening of these statistics. For defaults that are resolved within 3 years, we still see an increase in the life expectancy you would have otherwise expected by 2.2 percentage points. However, for the group that is in default for more than 3 years, and here we use everything that is lasting for more than 3 years, this amounts to 11.4 percentage points relative to the counterfactual. Now, again, kind of hard to wrap our head around what is that, 11.4 percentage points. So we do a sort of back of the envelope calculation and say, okay, let's say we use data from Zambia. We use its number of births that we saw in 2016. We look at the infant mortality in 2016, and then we plug this into our model here. If Zambia were to be the average default of the last 60 years, everything else held constant, by 2030, there will be 3,079 babies dying that otherwise would not have died. And with every day that passes, this number increases further. Actually, as we pass these 2 days of this conference in Paris now, that will correlate with an increase of babies that will die before their first birthday by 2030. Exactly 2 more babies that be expected to die in the expected value here. I leave it at that and come to a conclusion. The typical conclusion would be, what can policymakers do? I think with Axel and Sheila here on the table, I think we have the absolute experts who know what support they need to find a solution to these crises, so I don't want to say much to that. But before I hand it over, I'd like to leave you with a little appeal. There's a lot of rumors right now about Zambia coming to a resolution, or Zambia's creditors coming to a solution and a compromise. In all the rumors so far, I have heard nothing about what that solution looks like. Of course, it'd be exciting for Zambia to exit default and finally manage to access investment again. But it's important to also think about what that kind of restructuring looks like. To give you one more statistic, and I promise this is the last one, of all the defaults that we look at, 1 in 2 requires more than 2 restructurings to come to an end. That is to say, there's creditors and debtors that come together and find a solution and it doesn't work, and within 2 years they default again. And obviously I don't need to go back to what happens after these defaults, right? So we need to restructure this debt sustainably, and there needs to be sufficient debt relief. So that is a very important takeaway. It's not just a resolution, it needs to be a sustainable resolution. Now let me conclude on this. In the past, leaders of the world could have said, well, we didn't know that there was such thing as a social cost of sovereign default. Our research removes that excuse. It doesn't exist anymore. As sovereigns remain in default and aren't helped in their situation to resolve these crises, livelihoods are worsened, lives are shortened, and in the most disheartening case, lives are never even really started. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Clemens. I would say very sobering, but good that we have this data. Now let me turn to Fides, because this is the research, but you are the reality on the ground. You represent an organization with feet on the ground in a country, Zambia, that has been working on the debt restructuring for over 3 years now, so is one of the customers that Clemens has been looking at. How does this look on the ground?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Actually, I was listening to him, and I kind of became a little bit emotional because it's actually very true. Statistically, during the period post-default in 2020,
no, it's automatic. Maybe use this one.
I was saying I'm Fides Tembatemba from Zambia. I was actually agreeing when he was actually making the presentation, because statistically during the period post-default in 2020, Zambia, according to the 2015 Living Monitoring Conditions Survey, the poverty levels were at 54%. Post-default in 2020, we are now sitting at not less than 10% of poverty levels. Not officially, but we just had a census in 2022. The Living Condition Monitoring Survey not yet published. The information is that we are now sitting between 60 to 64% of Zambians living in poverty. And also, that really translates into that there's a lot of pressure in terms of quality of the living standards and welfare for the Zambian people. We've seen, like he was presenting, the quality of life. And coupled with the post-COVID, I think we've seen a situation where, first and foremost, there's been a lot of early child marriages because of poverty. Young people at the tender age of 10 in the most remotest places in Zambia. I was in one of the most remotest places last week. I could find a child at the age of 12 has a child who's 8 months and she's pregnant. When I went to the clinic, I wasn't feeling too well. I found a young mother at the age of 20 crying because the child who was 9 months old was critically ill, and the hospital could not give her the basic medication, like the one would prescribe for headaches. They didn't have, and they gave her a prescription, and this medication was costing $3 and she couldn't afford. So these are the realities of debt in our country. We've also seen an increase in child prostitution because people have to make ends meet at the end of the day. They have to eat. It's different to talk about statistics, GDP. What does it mean to an ordinary Zambian who needs to eat at the end of the day? They need to have food on the table. The numbers does not translate anything to an ordinary Zambian person who is actually living in poverty. We have seen high levels of cost of living in Zambia. I, for one, I have a decent job, but from time to time we complain because we cannot afford some of the basic needs that we need. I would imagine someone who doesn't have a decent job. How are they managing? How are they coping? We've also seen the high inflation rate. I mean, it's unpredictable to live in Zambia. Tomorrow the dollar is 19, the exchange rate is 19. 2 days it's going to be at 20, 3 days thereafter it's going to be at 17. It's just difficult to plan. Even for organizations, we have to be adjusting our budgets nearly after 3 months. because it's becoming very difficult to plan consistently for 6 months because of debt restructuring. And especially that it's so frustrating because we're very hopeful that after, an announcement that the staff level agreement has been, agreed upon, we've qualified, because government, one of the first things they did was to remove subsidies. And that made the situation quite critical for the Zambian people. And for us, primary education also, it's children, we have a policy, a free education policy now, but some of the facilities are not there. We have children sitting on floors. We have teacher-pupil ratio at 100, 1 to 100. And the children are not even sitting on basic things like proper chairs. So these are some of the realities of debt restructuring, but also debt default, because in the last 3 years, it has been quite difficult for the Zambian government to really meet in terms of the basic needs of the Zambian people. The other thing has been around, in the last quarter, we attended the symposium for the Zambia Revenue Authority. They were not able to meet the quota because of the economic situation. Small-scale businesses have gone down. People have closed their businesses because of kwacha depreciating. So you cannot do meaningful business. I'm sure you've heard about suspension of the Lusaka Stock Exchange in terms of revenue. What does that mean to the mining sector? And what does that mean in terms of loss of taxes, domestic revenue for the Zambian people? That helps in terms of planning the recovery plan for Zambia. We need to collect funds domestically as a nation to meet some of these plans. But currently, it's been very difficult for the government of the Republic of Zambia to meet the targets of the recovery plan in terms of economics. So it's really something that has been frustrating, both for civil society actors that have been pushing for debt restructuring. It's been frustrating for the ordinary Zambian people, because when the new government came into office, there was a lot of political promises, a lot of political campaign promises that they made to the Zambian people. And they thought it was going to be as easy, like tomorrow we're in the office, the following day the conditions will change. But we have seen the worst kind, because after COVID, the debt restructuring process, which has stalled for quite some time, I think we feel really frustrated as a nation, and the Zambian people are really in their need of the debt restructuring plan currently. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Haida. I'm reminded of a sentence that President Ishilema often mentions: you cannot eat democracy.
You can't.
So that's, thank you for also reminding us of that. Sheila, I want to now move on to you. What do we do when we've got highly leveraged creditors that are not the traditional ones? Whether it's China in the case of Zambia, or Glencore in the case of Chad, or whether it's Afreximbank or others in the case of Malawi. What do we do when the structures that we have created, like the Paris Club, are not fit for purpose?
Thank you, and first of all, thank you to the organizers, and I do think it's important to talk about the human face or the implications of delays. As you said, Clemens, we always talk about the output implications and jobs and so on, but we don't really delve into the social cost. I'm going to start by saying, though, that we need accountability at all levels and at all stages of the process, right? This is not the first time Zambia is going through a debt restructuring. So I think we also need to think about how to be accountable, how to be more transparent in terms of the debt that's being incurred, make sure that the society is aware of what different agencies in the government is committing the future generations to. So I think we need to take a bit of a more comprehensive. It doesn't start with debt restructuring only. We need to be taking measures to prevent getting there. And for that, I really think it's important to be accountable, and CSOs, of course, play a key role in that, holding the authorities accountable to make sure that they don't get themselves into not sustainable debt. So I think that's something we don't talk about much, but it's important. Then in terms of what you raised, right, we have now difficulties, the delays. We always had delays in debt restructuring. We always had repeated debt restructurings precisely because it's a complex issue, especially when there's private sector involved. You do end up needing repeat restructurings. It's less so when you have mainly official creditors. That has been the experience so far. But I think it's important to think about what is the architecture we have now, which is basically Paris Club, but then also the recent developments in terms of contractual clauses, which makes it much more difficult for the private sector to be a holdout creditor. We have lending into arrears policies at the fund. For when the private sector doesn't sit at the table, we can evoke the lending into arrears as long as the country is working in good faith. And we also even have lending into official arrears. So we have different tools that we can use, but it's not, the ideal, of course, is to agree and move on, because that's what the country needs, to agree on a debt resolution as much as possible to allow the country to grow going forward and be able to generate more investment going forward, especially now, these days, which we have huge needs for climate transition, for many other issues, poverty reduction, you name it. Debt is not a bad thing. So I always like saying there's good debt, bad debt, and ugly debt. And ugly debt is the governance, the accountability issue I talk about. Bad debt is when you don't have the competence in the countries to really think about what type of debt needs to be contracted. And there, the capacity development is a critical part of it. The bank ourselves provide countries with debt management. In the context of development banks, they help with project selection and so on and so forth. So that's on really importance of having the prerequisites, if you like, to be able to come to the table as prepared as possible. And the work on debt transparency, being able to reconcile debt quickly, is really critical. When you have contracts which are based on collateral, take Glencore, right? Glencore was very difficult to bring Glencore to the table, even with our lending into arrears policy, because Glencore had an escrow account. All the oil revenues were going to the escrow account, and they were collecting them. Because they had been restructured before, they learned their lesson, and they formed this escrow account, meaning that there's no way the country can run arrears to them. The payments are made directly to the escrow account. We need to make sure that we avoid practices like this. So I think that's another issue where we will need to work on. On the leveraged official creditors, we used to have much smoother mechanisms because we have the Paris Club, but the Paris Club didn't happen overnight. You know this very well, Axel. It took years for Paris Club to put in place the procedures that make it right now almost automatic. But we have new creditors like China, like Saudi Arabia, like India, who were not part of the Paris Club, who are learning some of these rules. And they have, especially in the case of China, they have a lot at stake because they are the largest creditor. And therefore, it's very important to work with them to, one, that they understand the rules of the game, but they also have the internal coordination mechanisms to be able to agree on a debt treatment. For the bureaucrat, it's very difficult to agree on a major loss that the country will be taking on if it's a large MPV reduction, because they have to report to the State Council and their jobs, and I don't know what else is on the line. So I think one has to also see it from the creditor's perspective, that they also have their own constraints. So making this long, to basically summarize, I think we need to understand the constraints of different parties that sit around the table and educate, learn together. And educate, I don't mean it in the context of we know better, I meant educate all of us. We also need to be educated. And try to make sure that we can address these issues as much as possible. What we are doing at the fund, we're trying to come up with mechanisms that can help us go forward, because we are stuck too. It was painful for us. We have a staff level agreement and we have many discussions, many visits to the country. It breaks our hearts and minds to see a reformist government for a change, making big reforms, and we can't support them. Our hands were tied. So I think it's important also for us to be able to come up with, and we're discussing with our board, is there a way to move forward, as long as there's good faith by all creditors, as long as it's just a matter of time, to be able to start the processes and let the countries move on, but then work on the details over time. So that's where we all need to work on, and we work very closely with our bank colleagues and of course the countries. So I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic that we'll make progress going forward.
Thank you very much, Sheila. So basically your message is let's ensure that we understand everyone has constraints and see how we can best manage them all. Axel, the bank has just released a rather grim assessment on the outlook for low-income countries moving forward. And this is over and above the needs that these countries will have also to invest in the technology revolution, adaptation to climate change, and now possibly the consequences of fragmentation due to the geopolitics. So what does it look on the ground, and what kind of tools does the bank have in order to support these countries?
Well, thank you, and sorry I was stuck in traffic, so I got there. Just on the debt, the repeated debt crisis and human crises are the worst aspect of the development agenda. These are repeat games, and we are seeing every time that these things are coming back. I led the HIPIC initiative in the 90s, early 2000s. What you are seeing is, and what I have concluded is, there is an inherent indiscipline on the debtor side as well as on the creditor side. So the only way to, I think, deal with this is the most radical transparency that is required, that people know for what debts are contracted, that they can be monitored, that people know the conditions, and ideally that there are control mechanisms in the countries that ask hard questions whether these debts are used for development purposes or for some other purposes. And I think this is repeating itself, and it is tragic because, as also Clemens has pointed out, it comes with a huge human cost. Now, I will say it is not, once you're in default, there was also a reason that you fell in default. So one should see that there are internal factors and external factors. In order to address it, you will need to address the reasons for this. And if you don't, you come back. So one of the things is, it is not only that you say you need an IMF program and a World Bank program, you need to look a little bit at the core things. And I would argue we have learned a lot over time that the social dimensions are included. If I'm recalling the HIPIC initiative, particularly the enhanced HIPIC initiative, that was directly linked with a joint effort by the fund and the bank on poverty reduction strategy papers. In fact, that we said that the debt relief needed to be addressed to increase social expenditures. So I think there was a good appreciation of this. I think we, believe it or not, the bank and I guess also the fund, we can learn. And I think that is where I think we need to do it. The tragedy, and there I will say this, that the fund and the bank pointed out when we were asked, as a result of the Gleneagles, to forgive most of our debts towards the low-income countries, we made it very clear to the whole membership that a space was going to be created for new borrowing. And if that was not going to be clearly monitored and also looked at, we could fall back. And what happened were investment bankers moving in and celebrating with ministers, and quite frankly also Zambia, for me, irresponsible Eurobond issues at incredible high rates. It was also non-Paris Club creditors that moved in, because to the credit of the Paris Club creditors, they learned. They had to actually write off usually 100%. And they moved into grant business and modest borrowing, but fairly strictly controlled. So that I think, people can also learn, but that I would argue on this. So this is one of the areas. Now, one of the things, what do you learn from it? What the bank learned after MDR that in Gleneagles was done, that we introduced ex-ante debt relief. And what did that mean? Is that when our debt sustainability analysis would show that a country would get into red light, we had the traffic light, red light meaning you're unsustainable, or there's a high risk that you fall in sustainability, that the bank would actually reduce to ease the conditions with which we give the IDA loans, these are already concessional loans, and that it would be on grant basis. And that has been happening. Just fast forward, in the sub-Saharan Africa, in the last 3 years, 2022 calendar years, we've committed $84 billion, of which 39 billion was on grant basis. Now, it will be interesting for a separate session for you and with the class, is the very uncomfortable question is, are grants the solution or a curse? And the reason that I'm asking everybody, which country developed only on the basis of grants? There is none. There is in every country a credit culture. That doesn't mean that you need to do it irresponsible, but any country, also Europe after the Second World War, required not only grants but also loans. And that happened. And I think one needs to reflect on it, that just putting countries only on a grant basis in the long run is also a problem and should be discussed. What is the desirable strategy? But we have a mechanism to deal with it. What is more important than ever, Idio, is when we are looking at the default situation, you see that a country is at the end of a rope, and there are domestic factors which have contributed, but also external. External, basically, that we are facing multiple crises, and that these countries, if you look at the COVID crisis, the OECD countries could have stimulus package equivalent to 12-14% of GDP. The poorest countries, barely 2%. That means, everything being equal, they had to cut other expenditures. Second, we have a huge and increasing security problem. When Gaddafi was taken out, many countries left that country to its own, with a result that there was a never-ending flow of weapons into the Sahel zone, and it has completely destabilized that zone. One needs to also then to say, what does that mean? That means that many of the countries have higher security expenses requirement, and everything being equal, they have less money available for social expenditure and so on. So that is the tragedy. And then you need to add on that the fallout of the war in Ukraine and climate. And so what it requires, and therefore I hope that this conference in Paris at least attracts some attention, we should not fail the low-income countries. And we are failing desperately, not only on the SDG agenda, on the climate agenda, but also the OECD countries are not doing their fair share to help low-income countries. Last year, the bilateral ODA fell by 8%. I think this is scandalous. I think you cannot fail on the poorest countries, and there you will need, on a sustained basis, highly concessional resources, but it should not only be concessional resources. When we are talking about food security, there is a big story that distorted trading policy and subsidies by the OECD are causing the misery in these countries. And I think we need to keep that and say that loud and clear. And so I think there is an enormous need that we have to act. And right now, the biggest concern we have is that people are orienting themselves, getting increasingly inward-looking and are forgetting the global responsibilities to deal with this. And that means that there are less support to these countries. And I hope that not only the Paris Conference, but then we have a G20 in India, we have the SDG Summit, and you may want to read the stimulus call by the United Nations Secretary General to help reverse the current trend. And the trend is negative, and therefore I think we need a lot of political support, as well as your voice to governments, that they actually need to do the bare minimum, not only on the bilateral basis, but to keep also a multilateral idea, because alone we will not be able to solve it. You will need to cooperate. I, for one, believe that the Bretton Woods organizations, we are not perfect, but we are, I think, also good vehicles for that type of cooperation, and we have to do much, much more. And our problem is the resources are missing.
Well, thank you very much. It gives us a good well, first let me tell you that we take on the offer to discuss whether it's grants or whether it's credit. We will be discussing this. I have my own views on that too, coming from a country that has gone through this discussion in the context of the EU stimulus package post-COVID. But let's park this conversation. Let me now move to Mark. Mark, you've spent a life in multilateralism. And these issues that we are discussing today are very much about the compact that binds all of us together. So how do we square this circle? And how do we here in a northern country, make sure that the southern part of the world also gets the attention that is required to solve an issue that is so existential?
Well, thanks, Arantxa, and thanks for gathering us all. And it's nice to see that we could actually populated several more expert platforms from those in the room. So it's nice to see many other experts here as well. Look, I mean, I think the whole purpose in commissioning this research, or at least, getting it sort of rerun in this way, was around a view that I suspect I'm not alone in having, that often the conversation about these issues is in two very separate tracks. There's the sort of Washington World Bank annual meetings, G7, G20 track, which is a quite technocratic conversation, powerful and important, but it's about sort of adjusting capital adequacy levels, redeploying SDRs. It's technocratic rich, but emotion light. And then there is a second language which I hear when I go to Nairobi or to Lusaka, which is this more anecdotal but often qualitative language as against quantitative language of the impact of debt and economic setback on the welfare of people and indeed on their very lives. And what I think is so important about this research is trying to bring those two conversations into one, integrating them so that suddenly, a delayed debt relief program, debt restructuring, is not just a sort of banker to banker or economist to economist policymaker discussion. It's a discussion about real lives. The clock is ticking. Kids are dying with every day of delay. And I think that's the compelling message of this research. And why bring it to Paris in the hope that we can inject a real sort of urgency and political momentum into the conversation here, that this is not just about technocratic fixes, it's about life and death. And that moves me to the second point, really, the answer to Arantxa's question, which is, this is a tired multilateral system. It's one which has really never escaped its post-World War II roots and governance and framing. It has failed to adjust to a dramatic shift, not just in world power, but in world needs. As demography has meant that whole new populations have grown in vast numbers in parts of the world which were previously very small countries, and at the time of the formation of these institutions were colonies without, a voice or vote at the table. And that gap between a system incrementally adjusting to these changing times and the actual change, the dramatic change in needs and geopolitical structure in the world, I think is coming to a point of crisis. I don't think it's a point of crisis which will sort of break open the floodgates in Paris. I think this is more of a kind of ginger group meeting of a selection of committed civil society and political leaders. But it can sort of start the water lapping, the tide lapping at the doors of these institutions. And, this is a moment where the institutions now, and it's been quite a while since I could say this, have very good leadership. It's the governments that are dragging their heels. And it's a moment, therefore, to use forums like this and the forthcoming G20, where the Indians have ambitious plans for relaunching the multilateral system and addressing issues of power imbalance in it. And then Ajay Banga's first World Bank president's annual meetings, and Kristalina's not anymore her first, but now there's a partnership there of two great reformers in these institutions. And so, there is a moment, and Paris can seed it, but what Paris needs to inject in it is not just, yes, let's do the SDRs, let's triple World Bank lending, but that sense of urgent global crisis leading to the need for a fundamental reboot of the system. Not going to happen overnight, but, given that, and trust the Brit to say this, that the French and its president love grand and historic moments, this could be a Paris moment where we trigger that kind of mobilization and movement.
Thank you very much. So in the tradition of Sciences Po, the floor is now to you for questions. Rather than comments and observations, let's make use of the excellent panel we have here to take questions. There is a mic at the center of the room, so you just go and put your question so that we get as much juice as we can out of our speakers. You have to go to the mic and take the question.
Sorry, just gonna say without mic. Hi, thank you very much for the insights, super interesting. As you briefly touched on the coordination between creditors, my question is, you mentioned now there's a huge member of other countries not included in the Paris Club. How do you deal with the relationship between different creditors, and when it comes to the negotiations and the coordination between creditors, can you please share more insights on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jay?
So, okay, yeah. So, well, there is the G20 Common Framework, which you may know about. This was basically after the COVID crisis. There was an initiative that was put forward by the World Bank president and the IMF managing director at the time for a debt service suspension initiative. It was for liquidity needs. It was basically so that countries can focus on COVID-related issues rather than trying to pay debt. But all it meant was push some debt to a later date. It wasn't debt forgiveness. It wasn't debt restructuring. It was dealing with the immediate liquidity needs. And the G20 discussed this, and then the common framework was put in place to basically bring creditors, Paris Club, non-Paris Club creditors, around the table as the official creditor coordination mechanism. So the common framework, which applies to all the low-income countries, is a way to discuss the needs for the debt restructuring and to agree on a debt treatment, which hopefully then should get comparable terms from the private sector and other creditors. It has been very slow. Chad was finished after a year. Zambia is, let's not jinx it, but almost done, and so on. So part of it is that we now have a mechanism. Paris Club was for the countries that are members of it. So we now have a mechanism which brings Paris Club and non-Paris Club creditors together. For countries that are not part of the low-income countries, like Sri Lanka, Suriname, and some others, we have, looking at the experience of common framework, trying to extend it to those countries, again, forming these informal creditor coordination mechanisms. What needs to be done? First of all, it is very important to allow common framework to be extended to other countries, because it is, even though it's slow and so on and so forth, at least it's a mechanism. It's starting to work, so that's one. Two, we need much more clarity on processes on how the common framework works. So some of the large creditors need to agree, when this happens within a month, this happens, when this happens. So there needs to be some more certainty, because otherwise no one wants to come to the common framework when it's taking so much longer. And also, there are several issues that required forming consensus, because the consensus is there with Paris Club creditors, but it wasn't there with the new creditors. So what we did is we formed this Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. It's 20 participants. It's co-chaired by the bank president, the IMF managing director, and the G20 presidency. Right now it's with India. And it's small, and we like to keep it small, because otherwise we're not going to get anything out of it. It's 4 advanced economies, 4 emerging market creditors, 6 borrower countries, which are basically all 6 that are relevant right now, so they're all included. 4 private sector creditors, and of course the international institutions, us and the bank as co-chairs. And the idea here is not to do individual country restructurings, that should be with the creditor committees, but to address issues that have been bottlenecks for the individual cases, like the role of MDB. So hopefully now that's addressed. The idea is not to try to include them into the debt restructuring, but rather more concessional financing as much as possible in grant terms, but more concessional financing from MDBs, issues on comparability of treatment. There was a workshop on it, 15th of this month. Information sharing from the fund and the bank in terms of our the sustainability analysis. We're doing a lot of work on this. So these issues that have been impediments in the individual country cases brought to the GSDR, which then at the G20 ministerial level tries to address these issues. And so far, we started this GSDR by saying, let's not raise expectations. It's a platform. Let's see how much we can get done. But I must say that it has been very good in actually resolving some of these issues. So hopefully with this approach, we will get the common framework to work faster, but the push from yourselves should be to ask for more clarity in terms of processes and procedures, more timely action from the creditors, be it the non-Paris Club creditors or the private sector creditors, and that these needs to be addressed in a way, and if there's a timing issue, that mechanisms are found to give the time to those that need the time, but at the same time go on with the restructuring that is necessary.
Thank you. Gentleman over there. Now you have to stand up and go to the mic. This is in the tradition of Sciences Po, sorry. Yes, you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the panel so far. My question is, could you speak to the geopolitics of the global community stepping up to try and solve the debt crisis? As we know, governments have many constraints besides saving lives, trying to help their fellow men. So what do you see as the geopolitical incentives for we know that there's huge clash of powers right now, it's becoming worse. That's my first question, and connected is...
Just one, so that the other colleagues can also... This is in the tradition of Sciences Po also. The students know this the hard way.
Ingo Ritz from the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. So it's good to see, to hear how successful the HIPIC initiative was. I mean, we as civil society fought for that in the Jubilee 2000 campaign. But I don't see really that the institutions have learned so much. I mean, we said it's a failing system. So don't we need another system under the UN where we have a more fair battlefield? Now we have the Paris Club, the rich countries in China, and there's one country like Zambia. And we see the common framework is not working. Don't we need another institutional framework?
Thank you. So we'll take a few, and like this we can distribute it in the panel. Gentlemen.
Hi there, my name is Mark Napier. I work for FSD Africa. I live and work in Africa, and we support the development of the financial system in Africa. Since I'm only allowed one question, is that right? Yes.
Sure.
Let me just ask the panel then for their opinions on this increasing sort of voice from Africa that the credit ratings agency system is rigged against African sovereigns, and so it's getting harder and harder for African countries to get a decent rating, which is obviously reducing investor appetite for sovereign debt.
Thank you. The lady.
Hi, I'm Eva from Debt Justice, based in the UK. I wanted to ask the panel if they could say a bit more about the role of private lenders, and partly because arguably maybe there was a bit of a lack of action that stalled both the DSSI and the common framework from that perspective. But also there's been some conversation both in New York and the UK recently around legislation and moving that forward as a way to unblock some of those issues with private lender debt cancellation. So I was wondering if the panel could comment on that and maybe say what they would like to see and what they would like to see coming out of this summit and other summits and statements from private lenders. Thanks.
Thank you. So private lenders, gentlemen.
So good evening. My name is Agri Aluso. I work with Pandemic Action Network as the Africa Director. I'm based in Nairobi. So just really reflecting on this powerful conversation, we've lived this failure, and Pandemic Action Network, which is an organization that works to break the cycle of panic and neglect in, the response to pandemics. Really, in Africa, we're responding to a failure that has been created by this kind of scenarios. A health system failure that has been, created by structures that, push out or squeeze out investment into critical sectors like health. And that continues. All presenters here have talked about the accountability challenge and, failure being on both sides. I think the World Bank director said failure is on both sides, the lenders and the creditors. I'm just wondering who bears responsibility for this, lack of accountability, because really what has been presented by our friend there is current leaders are stealing the future of those who are yet even to be born. In Africa, you're born and you already have a huge debt in your head. and you don't even live to pay that debt because you'll die. And things that can be managed like pandemics cannot be managed. And we have to get into this space of really now trying to create conversation around expanding the fiscal space that has been squeezed out by unfair debt system like the ones we're dealing with.
Thank you very much. Responsibility, who's responsible for accountability? Last two questions.
Thank you. My name is Joanna Meyer. Thank you for being here with us today. Up until recently, I lived in Tunisia, and because of this, I've been following the IMF loan, and I saw the degradation of the country. I arrived a week and a half before the parliamental shift, I'll call it, in 2021 in the summer, and very quickly, political dissidents have been rounded up. We're losing rule of law. My question is, if Tunisia doesn't get that loan, and how will that change the political structure, because they're going to look for the money from another source? And how, I understand that because of your roles, forecasting could be ill-advised, but because Libya is also next door, and most of the work that's been happening with the UN or other organizations in Tunisia hasn't been able to happen. For Tunisia, it's been working on Libya. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Carolyn from the World Resources Institute. It strikes me that there are quite a few moral arguments being made here. One for debtors, that they responsibly take on debt, one for creditors, that they responsibly lend money, and for the world, that we act quickly on debt distress because people are literally dying. And yet we have this huge tension here between those who are taking on the debt and lending the money to sovereigns that aren't very connected to those who are most tragically impacted by those effects. And even the research here itself, I bet we could have qualitatively gone into a lot of these populations and asked them what were the impacts of these, and we didn't need all the numbers per se to prove that this was the case. So my question for the panel is, what is your most audacious idea for changing the global debt architecture in a way that centers the needs of those most vulnerable?
Thank you. This was going to be my last question to the panelists, so now that it's on the floor, over to the panel. Let me start with Fides.
Thank you very much. I think I would respond to the aspect of accountability. And I think, like Sela said, I think its responsibility should be both to the creditors and the debtors. And one of the things, Zambia being in this debt crisis for quite some time, what we've noticed is there isn't the mechanism around debt, I think, is not there really. We cannot hold our leaders accountable. We only get to know that they've borrowed. For instance, I would give an example over the IMF concessional loan recently. The conditionalities were not actually publicized. They were not popularized. We didn't know about it. As civil society organizations, we wanted to know what our government was committing to. That was not given to us until they were signed. And then to make it worse, the legal framework also at country level. And for our country, it gives powers to ministers, to the president, to borrow as much as they can. And then who bears the brunt of debt crisis? It's the ordinary citizens. So I feel there should be an aspect where there's proper consultations, engagement, because it's the citizens that are actually bearing, the debt crisis. The debt crisis can be felt by the poverty situation, the poverty level. Our leaders, they have to fly to France if they have to get medical attention. They have all the facilities. I don't have the facilities that the leaders have. So I think accountability should really be maximized. There should be mechanisms and systems that should be put in place. And we personally feel, as a country that is in this debt situation, that there should be at least a situation, like for Zambia, we have a lot of creditors, like, it's been explained here. Is there a time when these creditors would say, no, we can't give you any more? Because then it creates a situation like this and a lot of complications. So the legal framework needs to be, the framework around debt, borrowing, but also repayment needs to be very clear. There's need for clarity, especially for least developed countries. And also, I think there's no much popularization of most of these instruments to the larger population. I think if it's put in open, then it gives even civil society from the onset to begin to dialogue with government as to what happens when you reach a situation like this. I think these are usually closed-door meetings between, the creditors and the government. The key stakeholders are not involved in this process. So I think these processes need to be more transparent if accountability has to be effective. I think transparency should start from the onset during the process of borrowing for accountability to work. I think it's very difficult to account for a system that is not transparent. So the governance around this debt situation needs to be very transparent, both levels, the creditors themselves and the borrowing countries. I think those are some of the questions I can respond to. Thank you.
Many thanks. Let me turn to Axel.
As I said before, I think I would promote the most radical form of transparency. The more, the better, from all sides. And on the countryside, I couldn't agree more. That should be discussed. And so you should put the debt strategy into the budget document. You should identify what you want to lend, what are the terms, and the creditor has to agree. Put it on the website. People should be accessing that information. I would add that it needs to be embedded in a debt strategy, because let's not forget, it is not only the foreign debt that is a problem, it's also in many countries the domestic debt. So it should not be done, well, there's only this bad foreign debt, there is also a lot of domestic debt. So there is this need for this. Now, let me also say we need sustainability. When we did HIPIC, we had an enormous effort to strengthen debt management systems. At the end 90s, beginning 2000, it still continues. There was now a conference in Berlin again about this. The problem is it's not sustained. And I think the international community cannot police, should not police. It has to be the government, but we need to facilitate that people can access this information and discuss it. Now, on the workouts, let's also keep in mind, the Paris Club is not a treaty organization. And it exists only on the basis of one word and one word only. And it has been hugely successful: trust. They may not like each other, and many probably didn't like each other, but they would work out a deal, and every country would translate that deal into the domestic legislation to restructure a debt. What is right now desperately missing on the common framework is trust. There is an excess distrust. And on the basis of distrust, you cannot get a deal. Because if you think that you are going to be manipulated, then it becomes a defensive game. And that is the tragedy, where then also the geopolitics start playing in, because there is no trust. I think we need to systematically work on that. The other part is the tragedy of debt default is that in its nature, it is like with somebody passing away, it is with grieving. It is first total denial by the creditor that there is a problem. Think of Mexico when they called in '82 the US Treasury that game over, we cannot pay. Then they did just a short-term rescheduling. That was not enough. Then they moved in '84 to multi-year rescheduling. Then the Baker Plan, more money. And it took till Brady, till the end '80s, that debt relief was necessary by a haircut. And this is actually what we're seeing right now with some of the non-Paris creditors, that they are going through a similar phase, because very often when the discussion is for a country like Zambia also, we need just essentially a liquidity solution. It is not, it is a structural problem. And that is, again, we need to have, in that sense, desperately a debt sustainability framework on which we can, again, discuss. And a debt sustainability framework that's more complicated than in the past, because in the past, when we dealt with the private sector was in arrears. Most of the non-Paris Club was in arrears, so these workouts were relatively easier. Now they are performing, and you need to add the domestic debt, and you need to start thinking about the effects of climate, because the costs are going to increase. So it's more complicated, but that is what is needed.
Thank you. Mark.
Thanks, Arantxa, and lots of good questions. I think they sort of fall into two buckets. There's the what can we do now to make the system better, and there's what can we do long term to completely relaunch the system and restructure it. Because you were right. I mean, you know, the debt deals now may be a bit better than they were, but the global situation of developing countries is pretty powerless, and the human factors that this report is showing up demonstrates that in spades. I think, you know, don't discount the new debt forum that Sela was describing. It's got six debt countries in it, not one. So it's not just Zambia, there are 5 others as well. So I put that into being a real incremental improvement over the Paris Club. It's got a wider group of people at the table. You know, I think it really can be a useful place to set policy. But obviously, ultimately, you need something blessed with real international legitimacy, which is why you mentioned the UN. But, you know, the UN has its own difficulties when it comes to these kinds of economic and financial issues. Its own credibility on those. Just a word on the geopolitics, and from there to the question at the end about what you could do. I mean, look, the geopolitics seems to me to be at 3 levels, one of which Axel mentioned, the trust level. But, you know, when we had the first debt crisis, it was in an era where never quite as fully as people claimed, but values had trumped interests. The original debt movement came after the Berlin Wall in a euphoric moment that the world was going to work together to address its issues. And, you know, having been at the 2000 Millennium Assembly of the UN, I felt that very strongly when even China signed up to a, you know, Millennium Declaration that called for democracy. And, you know, the pendulum's gone completely to the other end now, and we have a world where geopolitics is rife again, and it's trumped values at every stage. Second, we've still got a system which is rooted in the decisions of big powers. So you get a Zambia, and, you know, it's held in the waiting room indefinitely because the Chinese, the US, and the private creditors just can't quite get it together to be at the table. And I would say on the private creditors and around the issue of the credit ratings point, which is, you know, the Chinese are a useful fall guy for the private creditors. And they have displaced a lot of the spotlight and attention that I think should be placed on private creditors during this period. And so just finally to the point of what kind of debt relief. I actually, you know, Axel believes in credit. I take his point, but he's also presides over the great grant-making instrument of all time, IDA. And, you know, a really strong IDA, it's 12 billion short at the moment because it's been pre-spending, which is aimed at the poor with innovative mechanisms which really gets it to the bottom of the pyramid communities in countries like Zambia, but many other sub-Saharan and developing countries through sort of use of sort of cash benefits and other tools which get the spending and the economic benefit to the poor, because their spending can be the greatest growth shot in the arm possible. And linked to that, break with the austerity model, a much more pro-growth model, particularly at a moment like this, post a crisis which was only secondarily domestically induced, was primarily induced by global economic conditions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Shane.
So I will follow up on the point you just raised, Mark, on austerity, because austerity is almost like people think of IMF when you say austerity. I think, and there was a question about Tunisia, which links to this. I worked on different parts of the table, including in my own country, where we were putting our own program. There's a reason why it's called IMF supported program. People forget that word, supported. It's not IMF program. It should be owned by countries. It should be written by countries. And there was a question on Tunisia. We're waiting for the authorities to come up with the reform program that they agree on, the president included. So we are ready to work with them. And I think it's important to really understand the root causes of the issues and address them with the reforms that are necessary. And if there is no ownership, those programs don't work. The ones that you always hear about, there are 5 or 6 countries, I'm not going to name them, it's their 23rd or 26th program with the fund. Clearly, there's an issue in terms of taking the decisions that will address the structural problems or issues in those countries. So that's on ownership of reforms and taking the necessary steps to resolve issues, and then the fund, and of course our partners will be ready to support countries. On the new institutional framework, I like being pragmatic. I think it's best to work on what we have. There was a discussion about SDRM, which went nowhere. I think we need to get things done now and move forward. So taking pragmatic steps, making sure that we can build the trust, whether that's in the context of the GSDR, where China and others feel like they have a voice, that they are not, that they can also talk about their issues, will be critical. Last but not least, there are some really good proposals. For example, the collective action clauses have helped on the private sector side. There are proposals to extend that to syndicated loans, so keeping the pressure on the private sector to actually use those clauses is going to be extremely helpful.
Thank you. We started with Clemens. We will end with Clemens. Is there any last recommendation you have for us?
It's very hard to add something to all of the important things that have been said. Maybe just because I always like when people suggest new research, that's actually our experience with this. Like, why not look into narratives from other countries? Let's do it. I think that's amazing research that can be done in that direction. Because I'm the only one here who's not here with an institution, maybe I can answer to the idea of audacious ideas about the future of the international financial system. It's not actually that audacious, but I think it's an interesting sort of fact that we are just talking about international financial architecture when there is no architecture. In my opinion, the way that it looks is more like an ecosystem where every time a new creditor comes in, the whole thing needs to be rebuilt from scratch because things change completely. And I think that just hints at the fact that maybe we should think about building an architecture. Why not actually build an architecture that gives clear rules of how these things work? I think we need a couple of Paris summits to think about these. But I think there's something to sort of think about the big picture, and there has been, you know, 20 years ago, a debate about a bankruptcy regime for sovereigns. That is a debate that can be reopened, right? Back then, maybe the ideas weren't good enough. Maybe today they're better. We have only more financing needs with climate change that needs to be adapted for and mitigated. And I think the fact that the international financial architecture creates so much uncertainty is actually the main reason why today creditors are compensated with higher interest rates given the losses that they face on average in the long run than in the corporate side when they lend money to the sovereigns. And I think that is partly because we just never know how the next round of restructurings might look like because there is no set architecture. So maybe taking a step back and thinking about the big picture is something worth doing as well.
Well, thank you very much. This was a very interesting conversation. We continue tomorrow. The chair on sovereign debt at Sciences Po continues to work tomorrow, 10 o'clock. We have another interesting discussion. It'll be on the other campus in 1 Saint Thomas. Thank you to the panelists for this very exciting conversation. Thank you to all of you for being with us today.